Hello and welcome to the channel. If you've never been here before, my name is Erin. Normally on this channel, I usually talk about things that are to help improve home health and happiness and just improving on life. This video I'm going to actually be discussing that is actually going to be quite different today. It is actually something that is going to be a bit difficult for me. The topic has to do with a disease that people actually can get throughout any part of their life, and it affected one of my siblings in a very terrible way. It ended up taking his life. And so this video is going to be a little hard for me to make because I am going to be going in a lot of depth on talking about what happened and the symptoms to watch out for, because he had a very strange case. And I wanted to make this video to help let others know the severity of this disease. I have been looking over many different videos and reading on all kinds of different websites, trying to find as much information to see if things have really changed over the years since this happened. My brother passed away in 2003, and so it's been quite a long time. So I figured by now there would be a lot of science that have been done and a lot of things that have probably be changed, where they maybe at least would be getting people the knowledge that they need. And I did find quite a bit still out there, but at the same time, there's a lot of things that people are not talking about. And one of the biggest things is that you can die from this disease. The disease is celiac disease. And if you've never heard of it, it is a disease that is an autoimmune disease. It is triggered by an autoimmune response. And it's triggered when you eat gluten. And when you eat gluten, it starts to cause damage in your small intestine. And if left untreated, it can start causing damage in your nervous system, your bones, your brain, your liver, and many of your other organs. So it's very crucial to get checked out. If you have any thought that you could have celiac disease, it is imperative to make sure you get checked out. It is something that can be managed. So it's just to change the diet, but you can't change your diet until you've actually had the test, because when you go to get the test, they actually need you to eat the same. Whenever you start changing up your diet, it can actually cause a false positive reading whenever they do the blood work. And even if they do an endoscopy, if you say you stop eating gluten for a while, it can actually change what's going on in your body. And so it can give them wrong readings every time they've done a biopsy or whenever they're doing the blood work. So it's imperative that you don't change your diet up until you actually talk to your doctor and get the tests done. The kind of doctor you would want to see would be a gastroenterologist, and they will perform the blood test and an endoscopy to take a biopsy of what your small intestine looks like to see if there is damage being done. And for those of you who haven't heard of gluten, gluten is found in wheat, barley, and rye, but it is listed under many different names, which I'm going to put the list up on here today. That way you can see all the different names that it's under, so when you're out buying food, you know what to look for. And something else to know also is if you have a family history of other people in your family who have had celiac disease, you are actually at higher risk. So even if you're not showing symptoms, you can be asymptomatic and still end up having celiac disease. So you still want to make sure, if you have siblings or parents or grandparents, get checked out just to be safe. Make sure if you have children as well, this can run in families. It doesn't always present that way, but everybody who ends up with celiac disease ends up having the genes for it. There is actually a gene test that can be done, which can determine whether you are susceptible to getting it. If you come out negative, then you do not have a chance of getting it. But the most basic test that they will run on you is the blood work test and the endoscopy. Scientists have been conducting studies, and it has shown that celiac disease is increasing in the population. They are believing to have thought that this could be linked more to the foods that we're eating nowadays, because a lot more things are processed and there's a lot of fillers being added to foods. So it's good to be aware of what's actually going into the food, especially when you're buying it in a package from the grocery store, because a lot of things are labeled differently, and so it's good to know what you're reading. There are actually other diseases that put you in a higher risk category, such as type 1 diabetes and many different autoimmune diseases. So if you do have any autoimmune disease or you do have type 1 diabetes, make sure to be aware if you start developing any symptoms, especially in your gut, it can be celiac disease. So, I don't want to ever scare anybody into thinking that, they have something that could be life-threatening, but I want to make sure that people are aware of these symptoms because they can become life-threatening if you do develop celiac disease. And my intention would never be to scare anybody on here, but at the same time, I watched this firsthand and it was devastating. And it really was horrible to see him go through what he went through. And he was misdiagnosed. So when the medical system, they try to do their best, and, I understand doctors get very busy and they have lots of patients to deal with, but it's sad when a lot of things get overlooked. So this is one of the reasons I really wanted to make this video. If I could save even just one life out there, this video will have at least done some good out there and at least served its purpose. So, when I give you all these facts and this information, please don't take it as that I'm trying to scare you. I just really, really want you to understand the severity of this disease and to know all the symptoms that presented in my brother and all the symptoms that I've looked up online or looked up in books, just so that way I make sure I give you every little detail so that way you're not missing any information, because it's very hard to find a lot of it unless you just keep searching. This is going to be an extensive video. I do have a ton of information to share. I will be linking, well, I'll be writing in the description. I still am trying to figure out how to link everything, so bear with me on that, but I am going to be writing everything in my notes in the bottom in the description. I will be posting on here all the different types of foods to be aware of, the foods that are safe to eat, the different names for eating gluten, and much more information as well throughout the video. So I hope you stick around until the end to make sure that you don't miss anything, because I just have a ton of information that I really need to share. So stick around and make sure you watch all the way through. That way you don't miss any vital information. Other things that a lot of people maybe haven't heard of as well is something called sudden onset celiac crisis. And this was actually what they diagnosed my brother with. And by the time he was diagnosed, he was already in the ICU unit and was not okay at this point. And so when you are presenting as having sudden onset celiac crisis, it is when you have a rapid progression of the disease. So it becomes extremely life-threatening at that point, and a lot of people end up dying from it at that stage because it's already destroyed so much in your organs that it's really hard to recover from it. It's not impossible to recover from it, but it is very crucial to get help before you get to that stage and to really get on top of it before it ever gets to that point. So I want to discuss a little bit of the difference now between having actual celiac disease and having just a intolerance to gluten or even an intolerance to wheat. They don't actually think it's an intolerance to gluten necessarily. They're still trying to figure out what's causing people to have that kind of sensitivity. They think it's something that's actually being added into the foods along with the wheat. So, it's still, if it still helps in your digestion, it's one thing, but always make sure you get the test before you start changing it just because of the other reasons. But one thing to know is if you do have sensitivity, it doesn't cause the damage that celiac does. But one thing I want people to know is it's not a good idea to change your diet unless you have these problems. You actually are going to be missing out on a lot of nutrients. You won't be getting as much fiber in your diet. You'll be lacking thiamine. And a lot of the nutrients that you can get from these foods is very crucial to have in your everyday diet. So make sure that you get checked out before you start altering stuff like this. It's just very imperative that people understand that. The next thing I want to discuss is the symptoms. And so it's quite a long list, but there are actually only a few main ones that a lot of people tend to get. And these are the more common ones. So the most common symptoms that usually people present with are gassiness, bloating, indigestion, fatigue, diarrhea, and you can also develop anemia or iron deficiencies due to lack of nutrition being absorbed into your body. This disease actually keeps you from absorbing certain nutrients because of the damage that it causes in your intestine. So those are usually the main characteristics that people usually present with, but I'm actually going to go over the rest of it, all of the other list. That way you can see all of the symptoms that can present. Some of these may sound a little strange, but this is how my brother presented. First on the list for celiac disease, aches and pains, indigestion that we discussed earlier, bloating or swollen belly. A lot of people present with a swollen belly. Have nausea or vomiting, gassiness, very fatty stools, heartburn, bone loss, fatigue, malnutrition, slow growth, weight loss, abdominal cramping, itchy skin, skin rash that actually kind of looks like eczema. It can show up in different areas of your body. My brother's was in a strange spot that was a little less common. It was behind his legs, so most of the time they usually show around the elbows and knees and areas like that, but just know that it can present anywhere, and it looks like a blistering rash that kind of looks like a scab. It scabs over after a little while, so just be aware of looking for any abnormal skin changes. You can have diarrhea, constipation, anemia, which I mentioned earlier, and behavioral issues. It can make somebody become a lot more sensitive to strange things and become very emotional. Dental and enamel problems that can even present at a very young age. They start noticing you get a lot of cavities and other things. Keep that in mind when you're going to the dentist. Liver and biliary tract disorders, such as like gallbladder problems. Depression or anxiety. Peripheral neuropathy, such as tingling, numbness, or pain in the hands and feet. Migraines. Canker sores in mouth. You can have very pale skin. And just overall not feel very well. Those are the main characteristics that present in this. My brother actually did have a few that were a little strange. Besides him having very pale skin, he also had very dark circles around his eyes. And we couldn't figure out why he wasn't getting any color in his skin, because he would still go out in the sun off and on. He wasn't really having any pigment. You know, it was due to lack of nutrients that he was absorbing. And, you know, we just didn't realize that that was part of it. So some of the other things that my brother presented with that seemed a little strange, but we didn't connect the two until later on, was a lot of his behavioral issues. He had a lot of dental problems growing up. He actually had to have caps across all of his front teeth because his enamel was so damaged. They thought that he was on the autism spectrum, because he would get very emotional, especially when it became to food. But he would do a lot of things that just didn't seem normal, but he would still act kind of normal sometimes, but it was kind of back and forth. We were trying to get him checked out to see if he was on the autism spectrum, but never actually got to see whether or not he was, or even really realized that he was that sick. We just always thought he was very pale and just acted very strange, but you know, you don't really think about these things because it's not that commonly talked about. The difference between just the normal symptoms in celiac disease and when it starts presenting into becoming a celiac crisis point is when the person can no longer keep food down. My brother actually was misdiagnosed with having a virus. They thought he had the flu to start with, and then they thought he just had a really bad bug that wouldn't go away. My brother was actually throwing up for over a month. And my parents kept taking him back into the doctor, and they just kept misdiagnosing him, unfortunately. But the problem was he was no longer putting on weight. He had constant diarrhea, was vomiting, very nauseated, extremely lethargic, had no more energy, and extremely weak, just was sleeping or laying in bed for days. And he would try to eat, but unfortunately the foods he was eating was actually causing him more harm. My brother actually had a problem with wanting to eat specific foods. If he didn't get the foods he wanted, he would actually have a meltdown, and this was part of the behavioral problem. So if he didn't get the foods that he was asking for or that he was comfortable eating, he would start screaming and crying and just act like he was a child just having a tantrum or just having a meltdown. And he was much older. He was a teenager at this point and was still doing these things. So it was very hard to get him to eat properly, to help him get a lot of different types of foods into his system. He was actually eating a lot of gluten. Most of his favorite foods were eating peanut butter sandwiches or eating blueberry muffins. And those are, you know, some of the top lists of foods that would have gluten in them. He was also into eating fruits and a few other things, but overall he was just very stuck to eating a certain way. So that's another thing to also be aware of. If you notice somebody is very attached to eating certain things and you notice them having behavioral problems around this, maybe there's something that could be going on there. I'm not saying that that's necessarily the situation. A lot of kids are very picky with what they eat. Unfortunately, that's just kids. But it is something to be aware of. If you do notice it, it can be something to watch out for. But other things that led up to him being into the hospital, besides him throwing up so much, since he wasn't putting on any weight, my parents finally got the doctors to put him into the hospital. And once he got in the hospital, they realized his gallbladder was failing, but they hadn't tested him at this point. So they took his gallbladder out, and it actually caused him to go further into his crisis from the celiac. And he started having a high fever. His brain started to deteriorate, and he started acting extremely strange in the hospital. And at this point, he didn't know anybody was around. I was able to talk to him a little bit. My mom was trying to talk to him, and he had no idea that we were really there with him. He was doing very strange things with his hands and with utensils, and it was like he had lost all his brain function to help him figure out what he was doing. He was doing very strange motions with his hands and the utensils. And so it was very disturbing at this point. And so we were trying to get the nurses to get the doctors to see what he was doing. And unfortunately, things started taking a turn for the worst at this point. He ended up having a seizure and a heart attack shortly after all this had happened. I believe he was at like 105 at this point on his fever. So they ended up actually sending him to another hospital to see if they could get him better treatment. And at this point, he was very far gone and had to be put on a ventilator. So this all can occur at a very quick pace. You know, if you notice somebody that's throwing up for a month, you think of that as a big red flag. That is something to really be concerned about, because they're not able to absorb any nutrients at this point. So, you know, I would hope, you know, that the doctors would take knowledge in the fact that if you're throwing up for longer than a week or two, that's probably a big thing to get somebody into a hospital at that point and make sure that they're being taken care of properly. Another problem was the food that they fed him in the hospital. He ended up going into a further progression from this disease, was that they were giving him the kind of food that actually caused him harm. So, you know, that's unfortunately what ended up happening, and he wasn't able to come back from that. His brain had just been too damaged, and his organs had been too damaged at this point. So, sorry, this is very difficult for me to discuss. Even though it's been many years since this happened, it's still very vivid in my mind. So, you know, it feels like I'm having to relive it again. So, I apologize if I'm a little off, but I just really hope this makes somebody very aware of the severity of this disease, and I really hope this does save a life. So the other symptoms for having just gluten sensitivity or intolerance would be bloating, headaches, abdominal cramps, a rash, constipation, diarrhea, fatigue, aches and pains, and weight loss. But with these symptoms, you just wouldn't get the damage that celiac disease would cause. So, you know, it may help relieve some of your symptoms, but even if you were to keep eating this way, it wouldn't be life-threatening. So those are the differences between the two. And since it runs in families and it was one of my siblings that had it, we all had to get tested. And I will still have to keep getting tested over my lifetime. Even if I don't develop symptoms, I still have to get checked every 5 or 6 years. That's what they recommend. I don't know if things have actually changed. I should probably look that up as well. But just know that you still have to get checked throughout your lifetime if you do have close family members that have been tested and came out positive for celiac disease, because you can develop it at any point in your life. So I will have to keep getting checked, and at least, you know, there are at least ways to control it and to still have a great life, even if you have to change your food a little bit. It's not that big a deal. There's a lot of options out there, so just know that. I'm going to go over the list now of different foods to be aware of and foods that you may not know that it actually could be in. So the most common types of foods that you'll see that contain gluten would be breads, pizza, cakes, pies, cereals, cookies, crackers, wafers, croutons, pastas, and seasoned rice packets. Now, some that you may not suspect that may actually have gluten in them would be foods like meat, fish, and poultry. And most of the time it's because they're packaged meats and or deli meats. And the reason is because they add hydrolyzed wheat protein into processed meats. The next thing would be meat and fish substitutes, such as like plant-based meats, like veggie burgers, sausages, bacon, crumbles, or any imitation seafood and seitan. Some other foods would be chips and fries. And normally these foods would be considered as naturally gluten-free, but potato chip seasonings may contain malt vinegar or wheat starch, and any types of foods being fried in oil due to cross-contamination from other foods that may also have gluten in them. Oats normally are also gluten-free, but may have been cross-contaminated because of where they are packaged at. Packaging companies have a lot of different types of foods inside their factories and facilities, and unfortunately can become cross-contaminated. So you just need to make sure on the label that it says it's certified as gluten-free. Beverages and alcohols. It may be found in flavored coffees and teas, beers, ales, and lagers, or malt beverages that also have gluten in them. Note though that some alcohols that do not contain gluten are gin and vodka that are distilled. Also, wines are naturally gluten-free. Medications and supplements. A lot of medications and supplements use gluten as a filler or a coating in them. So always let your doctor know if you are being prescribed any medication to make sure there is no gluten in those medications or supplements. There's also sweets and snacks such as flavored ice creams, different types of candy such as licorice, energy bars and granola bars, soy sauce, except for tamari, that one's okay, but most soy sauces are made with wheat, and also miso may be made with barley. Other foods such as salad dressing sauces or just other sauces in general, make sure to check those also to see if they contain gluten. A lot of dressings are made with gluten. Another food would be Ezekiel Bread, which is a sprouted bread. It's made from wheat and barley. Soups and gravies have gluten in sometimes added as a thickener. One other thing that most people may not know is that you can actually find gluten in products such as lotions, shampoos, and conditioners. So really check all of your labels, because even getting on your skin, you can still absorb it. So now I'm going to go over the list of different types of names that you would see on an ingredients label. That way you know what to look for in case it doesn't just say wheat or gluten on the product. So I'm going to try my best with these names, but they are in Latin. The first one is Triticum Vulgare, which is wheat.
The second one is Triticale, which is a cross between wheat and rye. Next is Hordeum Vulgare, which is barley. Next is Secale Cereale, which is rye, and Triticum Spelta, which is a form of wheat.
Food and ingredients list to watch out for when a product is not labeled as gluten-free is any product that says it has starch, modified food starch, hydrolyzed vegetable protein, hydrolyzed plant protein, textured vegetable protein, dextrin, maltodextrin, glucose syrup, caramel, malt flavoring, malt extract, malt vinegar, and brown rice syrup. Now, when looking at vinegar, know that distilled vinegar is okay though. I know that seems like a long list of items that you have to be aware of, but unfortunately a lot of food companies don't always label things the same. So, you really have to be cautious when you're buying any kind of products that are actually packaged foods. But I'm going to go over a list of foods that are safe that you don't have to worry about when you are shopping at the grocery store. The safe foods are any fruits, vegetables, unprocessed meats, normal rice that has not been in a seasoning, quinoa, corn, buckwheat, potatoes, sorghum, beans, legumes, eggs, flax, gluten-free flours, and millet, and gluten-certified free foods. Make sure not to cross-contaminate when sharing toasters, cutting boards, and products. Use on foods containing gluten also. Because even using any cutting boards or knives or anything that somebody may have used, say if you take a knife for spreading peanut butter onto your bread and you go and use that same knife to spread peanut butter onto yours as well, some of those particles from the bread can actually end up on that knife and be spread onto your bread. And just really making sure you're not using the same utensils or anything like that. It can become very dangerous, especially if you're accumulating big amounts of it. Even 10 milligrams can be too much. And something else that I didn't discuss was other problems that can occur on top of having celiac disease, especially if you just keep eating the same way. You may not die from it necessarily, but it can also cause other illnesses on top of it. So one major problem is having intestinal cancer. It can cause lymphoma, which is another type of cancer, and it can also cause osteoporosis. So, there's a list of other problems that can occur alongside having celiac disease. If you are hesitant on changing up your diet, just know that these are other factors that can play a part in this. If you are having any of these symptoms, please go get checked. I really hope nobody else out there has to suffer with these symptoms and gets misdiagnosed. It's very sad when it's something that could have been prevented and it just got caught too late. So I really hope somebody takes this information and actually takes the initiative to go out there and get checked. But thank you so much for listening to my video. I do apologize that it was so long. I had a lot of information to give you all, so thank you if you sat all the way until the end. I really appreciate you watching. And until next time, thanks again. Bye.